Good day. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holachek, and I come to you from my hermitage. You know me as a Thomas Jefferson scholar, philosopher, historian, and well-credentialed when it comes to Thomas Jefferson. And one of the things I find fascinating about Jefferson, people ask me, well, why do you write so many books? And the answer in part is, well, in some sense I know the man, and I like him. And he's had his hands in so many different things. And more than that, more than the breadth and depth of his mind, is that I'm convinced that there was a certain joie de vivre about the person as he went about everyday life. And I do mean that. In my efforts to get to know Jefferson, one of the things I've made it a point to do is not only read everything that Jefferson has written, but also read the things that he consistently read, the works in religion or politics and philosophy and ethics and history, in poetry, among the sermons he read, all those sorts of things that he consistently read and recommended throughout his life. He was no stranger to going back to books time and time again, and there's a good reason for that, because he read very often for moral content. He was very much interested in improving his life and improving in not reading to learn lessons, but reading to sort of reinforce what he already knows. One of the greatest, if perhaps the richest sources of influence in terms of moral content, strangely enough, is Reverend Lawrence Sterne, the author of a couple very off-the-wall novels during Jefferson's time, the Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy Gentleman, and something written thereafter, A Sentimental Journey through his travels, through Sterne's travels in France and Italy. Now, Sterne was a minister and a novelist, and he had a very playful approach to writing. He was in one of his chapters. He actually has a one-sentence chapter, and if you read Jefferson's notes on Virginia, Jefferson too, and I don't remember which query it was. He has a one-sentence query of the 23 queries in his notes on Virginia, and I don't know if it has something to do with the seaports or something in Virginia. Perhaps, I'm not sure. I don't remember quite well. He says, we covered this pretty much in the preceding query. Now, why doesn't he just collapse that in and put that into the preceding query and just eliminate that? I suspect he's being lambent. He's being playful here. And I think he gets that from Lawrence Sterne. Now, Jefferson considered fiction in a strange sense, even though he preferred to read history and philosophy. He considered fiction, he says in an early letter to Robert Skipwith, 1771, as a superior source for moral instruction. He writes, considering history as a moral exercise, her lessons would be too infrequent if confined to real life. What he means by that is that the writer of fiction, the novelist, for instance, has the advantage over the historian as he has access to fiction. He has access to false stories whenever he feels like it. He writes fiction, essentially, to put it that way. And that, if he wants to get a moral point or demonstrate a moral point, he has many, many more ways about going about trying to do that, many more effective ways than the historian, presuming that the historian is not one of today's revisionists and indifferent to facts. Okay, so that's one of the advantages. So he drew and he loved Sterne's two works, his Tristram Shandy and his Sentimental Journey. One of the things Jefferson always practiced, and I think he learned at some point, and he tells his daughter Maria this in 1802 when he's president. He castigates her for her sort of willingness to want to withdraw. Now, Jefferson's relationship with Maria is complex, and we need to say something about that at some point. But she would die, was it 1804, I think? Not a couple of years after that, with a complication due to her pregnancy. And but he castigates her for her willingness to withdraw from society, and he tells the story about at some point he tried to do that, and he never found himself to be more miserable than at that time, right? Now, Sterne always, in his sentimental journey, he calls himself a sentimental traveler. What does he mean by being a sentimental traveler? And by that, it simply means sentiment. Jefferson, like Sterne, believes in the moral sense, that morality is a matter of sensing, not rationalizing, not appealing to reason and thinking through things. So Sterne is talking about in the sentimental journey is just having every day of your life should be a sort of adventure, filled with adventure. And one can find, and the other thing is one can find adventure in the slightest things, the things other people would not consider to be adventureful, to coin a neologism. Now, Sterne writes in Sentimental Journey, he goes, "I seldom go out to the place I set out for. I am governed by circumstances. I cannot govern them." There's a sense in which, and I think I take him tongue-in-cheek here, that circumstances overwhelm him. And he means that tongue-in-cheek in that he goes out, imagine taking a walk, and you see someone gardening, and you talk to the gardener, and you might learn something about gardening, or you just experience some things you've never experienced. You look at something differently. It's toward the end of February, and in Lynchburg, all the crocuses are coming up. My daffodils are up already and blooming, and all the trees most of the trees, I should say, a lot of the fruit trees are budding. Certainly my peach trees are, and that's a little weird, but I mean, it's quite beautiful, to see how things go on. I got my Jefferson up here, sitting on the desk looking at me. He's always got to be a part of these sentimental traveler series here. Now, Jefferson, too, to General Andrew Jackson, writes of life as a sort of sentimental journey. I read from him in a letter to 1823 letter near the end of his life to Andrew Jackson. He says, "The motions of a traveler are always controlled by so many imperious circumstances that wishes and courtesies must yield to their sway." This is a different way of articulating, Jeff, you're going to get on my keyboard, that's not good, of articulating the same thing that Sterne said. Now, to talk of Jefferson as a sentimental traveler in the manner of Lawrence Sterne, I'm going to make 6 or 7 or so, talk of 6 or 7 commonalities and look for quotes from each. So I think, Jefferson had this sort of playful, this lambent approach to everyday life that Sterne did. Sterne writes, the first point is that a sentimental traveler goes through life with his eyes open fully, and his head, his attention turned to everything that is there. Sterne writes, "What a large volume of adventures may be grasped within this little span of life by him who interests his heart in everything." And in Sentimental Journey whoever has eyes to see what time and chance are perpetually holding out to him as he journeyeth on his way misses nothing he can fairly lay his hands on. Again, he writes, "The man who either disdains or fears to walk up a dark entry may be an excellent good man and fit for 100 things, but he will not do to make a good sentimental traveler. I count little of the many things I see pass at broad noonday in large and open streets. Nature is shy and hates to act before spectators, but in such an unobserved corner you sometimes see a single short scene of hers worth all the sentiments of a dozen French plays compounded together." So one needs to go down nature's dark paths to see what nature is hiding. I don't take, these metaphors literally per se, but I think all he is saying is that one needs to look at the things that most people don't look at. And Jefferson has a similar sentiment. He says, it is unfortunate that most people think the occurrences passing daily under their eyes, this he writes in a 1786 letter to his lifelong friend John Page, are either known to all the world or not worth being known. They therefore do not give them place in their letters. In 1787, while he's in France, he sort of lectures the Marquis de Lafayette, and he says, this is about Lafayette's presumed peregrinations. Jefferson went on a tour throughout southern France and Italy, and he's sort of advising Lafayette, the French Revolution is about to come, about putting in a new government. And Jefferson tells him to go to those parts, go see how the peasants live, sleep in their beds, eat the food, don't tell them who you are. And Jefferson talks of himself. He says, I'm constantly roving about to see what I have never seen before and shall never see again. In the great cities, I go to see what travelers think alone worthy of being seen, but I make a job of it and generally gulp it down all in one day. On the other hand, I'm never satiated with rambling through the fields and farms, examining the culture and cultivators with a degree of curiosity which makes some take me for a fool and others to be much wiser than I am. Is ever, I think, makes sense to be a never. It's a misuse of the word. He's saying, when I go out, I have to, I follow the path that travelers often follow, but then I go, like Sterne was saying, go down those dark alleys. I see things that nature's hiding. A second commonality is that a sentimental traveler travels au pied levé, meaning foot up, foot elevated. And by that I mean if my foot is up, it can go down, it can go right, it can go left, it can turn around and go back. I'm in a matter of indecision in some sense. And so the traveling, even though he travels au pied levé with his foot elevated, he's neither not traveling without an aim, nor is he goaded only by mere inquisitiveness or interestedness. Sterne writes that the sentimental traveler strives for useful knowledge and real improvements of character. He says, I have a mortal aversion for returning back no wiser than I set out. He says that in his sentimental journey. Now, Jefferson had a similar sentiment about, for him, as we talked about on many occasions, the most important knowledge was useful knowledge. And he writes to Augustin François Sylvestre in 1807, while Jefferson is president. He says he, too, like Sterne, is interested in useful knowledge and real improvements of character. To Robert Skipwith, we go back to that early 1771 letter, he says, everything is useful which contributes to fix in the principles and practices of virtue. A third commonality is that a sentimental traveler is modest and humble. And Sterne mentions that while he was traveling through France, he had a celebrity for having written his books, and he's sort of feted and treated as a celebrity wherever he goes. And Sterne writes, at this price I could have eaten and drank and been merry all the days of my life in Paris. But then he qualifies that, and he says, 'twas a dishonest reckoning, the gain of a slave. He says he grew sick of that, of being fed. You get all this, but what you gain from being treated like a celebrity, eating well, and whatever, being entertained lavishly, is you become a sort of slave to those sorts of entertainments. He says, again, there is not a more perplexing affair in life to me than to set about telling anyone who I am, for there is scarce anybody I can give a better account of than myself. Jefferson, likewise, followed in creating his two Bibles, one in 1804 and one in 1820, follows the example of Jesus. To William Short in 1820, he talks of Jesus' precepts and Jesus as the purest source of the purest morality. And his life, too, is sanctioned by a life of humility. And Jefferson, as we've talked of before, is not paying mouth honor to Jesus' teachings. He took them rather seriously. I would argue that two very important moralists for Jefferson, first was Jesus, and second, there was Lawrence Sterne. He talks of Tacitus. But I think Lawrence Sterne was, in a playful way, a very important source of sort of living joyfully, living inquisitively. So another thing, a sentimental traveler is self-controlled. Sterne writes, "There is nothing unmixed in this world, and even enjoyment itself was attended ever with a sigh." Again, he writes, "A man has a certain compass, and the social and other calls have occasion by turns for every key in him. If he begins a note too high or too low, there must be a want either in the upper or under part to fill up the system of harmony." Right? It's, in other words, he's talking about living, in some sense, living a moderate life, as the ancient Greek inscription at the Temple of Delphi, nothing too much, maiden agam, nothing too much, everything in moderation. Jefferson, in a letter, 1787 letter to Madame de Tott, writes, "The plan of my journey as well as my life being to take things by the smooth handle, few occur which have not something tolerable to offer me." But tolerable, I think he doesn't mean in the tolerable in the sense we take it today. Something interesting, something enjoyable to offer me. Don't go and complicate matters. Be conciliatory, as he always was, following Ben Franklin. Take matters by their smooth handle. You'll wind up not having the same number of problems later on. Tell the truth, for example. Fifth, the sentimental traveler uses language with laxity and imagination, and to gain its fullest effect and to communicate the sentiments of the heart most completely. If you read Sterne, he has a very lambent, a very playful approach to the use of language. As I mentioned, in one chapter he has one sentence, and just to throw off readers, you're supposed to do that, but Sterne's going to do it. Jefferson plays. I'm fascinated when I read Jefferson, when I read anyone. You could tell by my book reviews, I don't just read the content. I look for style. I look for structure. Can an author put together a correct sentence? Could put the adverb where it belongs, the participial phrase where it belongs, not split infinitives, and so forth. But you know the rules of the game, but play with language and have fun with it. In Sentimental Journeys, Sterne writes, there are certain combined looks. He's talking about here about the limits of language. There are certain combined looks of simple subtlety where whim and sense and seriousness and nonsense are so blended that all the languages of Babel set loose together could not express them. They are communicated and caught so instantaneously that you can scarce say which party is the infector. Here he's not talking so much about language, he's talking about the limits of language. That said, he says, if you look at an expression on a person, you can see things that, you can see 1,000 expressions. As Rod Stewart would say, every picture tells a story, don't it? And, that there's a story. You take a simple picture, frozen in time, and there's a story to it, maybe a book-long story, right? And that's, in a sense, what Lawrence Sterne is writing. Jefferson, too, one of the things is that Jefferson, when he wrote, he catered to the interests of his interlocutor, of the person to whom he was speaking or writing, of his correspondent. He catered to the correspondent. He wrote. He never tried to one-up the person by showing himself to be the intellectual superior of that other. But he thought, we'll do something on Jefferson in language in a further Sentimental Traveler lecture. but he used language playfully. He spoke in such a way that he wanted to communicate plainly, not mysteriously what he was trying to say, unlike what so many other Jefferson scholars say. Is you got to read into Jefferson to find out he was a racist and rapist, and you need to relax, Jeff. You've been really crazy today. So Jefferson knew the grammatical conventions, as did Adams and even people like Washington, who weren't as intellectual as those two. When you find that oftentimes I think he takes liberties with grammatical convention, as I do at times, just to have some fun, just to play a little bit. Sit, Jeff. Sit down. Okay? He complained always of writing letters. He said it's a very tedious process, and I suspect it wasn't for him. It was tedious at times because he answered letters to just about everyone who wrote to them if the letter needed an answer. So he would often spend much time writing to strangers. Jeff, sit down. Okay, so again, the sixth point, a sentimental traveler has a sense of humor, right? And I don't need to give incidents of that in Sterne. If you just pick up one of his books there, you'll see a number of illustrations of Sterne's playful sense of humor. He's a delightful read and plays with the language. And he was a very good sermonizer, by the way. His sermons were very, Jefferson loved his sermons as well. Yes, Jefferson, even though he wasn't so interested in sectarian religion, read sermons by people like Sterne, who was a great sermonizer, Reverends Bordelou and Massillon, the French, he recommended their sermons, and I have their sermons, and I've read them. And there's a lot of metaphysical trappings in there, and Jefferson pushed all that aside and looked for the moral content in these things, like he looked for more content in fiction. He writes in 1788 a letter to Maria Cosway when Jefferson is touring through France, and he talks about the time when he was touring through France and through what's now Germany and the Netherlands. And he says about his time at Strasbourg. He says, at Strasbourg I sat down to write to you, to Maria, but for my soul I could think of nothing at Strasbourg but the promontory of noses, of Diego of Slaugenbergius, his historian, and the procession of the Strasburgers to meet the man with the nose. This is talking about Sterne. In Tristram Shandy, he talks about a man with an enormous nose. And many people think that Sterne is talking about a man with an enormous penis here. I don't know if I buy that, but that seems to be the consensus. And Jefferson said, had I written you from thence, it would have been a continuation of Sterne upon noses, and I knew that nature had not formed me for a continuator of Sterne, so I let it alone till I came here and received your angry letter. This is from Volume 3, Chapter 31 in Tristram Shandy. The passage to which Jefferson refers. Cosway gets this, and she reads it, and she writes an angry letter. Jefferson's not been writing her. She's even madder. He says, I asked you, I scold you for not writing to me, and then you talk about, if I had written to you, I would have been writing about noses. What the hell is this noses stuff? Clearly, she doesn't get that this is from, she probably has never read Tristram Shandy or cared to read it, and doesn't get Jefferson's joke. This is one of, I think, two instances in Jefferson's whole corpus where I find Jefferson being funny. And it really is funny if you understand, if you've read Tristram Shandy. Now, 99% of the people that read this who are familiar with Jefferson won't get the joke because they haven't read Tristram Shandy, as I have. And and that's part of it. Jefferson has a humor that sort of I like as well. When I lectured in philosophy, perhaps to pass the ennui sometimes that attends upon lecturing on a particular topic, I would always mix things up, so not to be bored, and sometimes just to break the routine of giving a lecture. I would tell a joke like this, have a very off-the-wall remark that essentially no one in the class would get. So I would, in some sense, the French say, je m'amuse. I amuse myself. In other words, I'm telling a joke that only I'm going to get, and that's fine, because that's the aim here. I want to amuse myself or laugh myself. Every once in a while, and I'd tell a sort of Jeffersonian joke in this, I would say something off the wall that just goes right over everybody's heads. At one time, I remember a young lady starts laughing. She got it. I'm thinking, who the hell is that? I don't know that. I'm not familiar with this. She's never said anything. She got my comment. It's dark. It's dry. It's highly inaccessible, but also, it also showed me she had a profound, interesting sense of humor. She was probably fairly highly intelligent. I think people with a good sense of humor are highly intelligent. So I had to, looking the rest of the term, I was looking at this young lady and thinking, okay, let me get to know you a little bit better, because you've shown something to me that that interested me. Anyways, and the last point I wish to make is that a sentimental traveler is a lover. And Sterne in Sentimental Journey, in Tristram Shandy, there are episodes of lovemaking and so forth. It's not inconsistent with the Sternian mission in life that, it didn't have chasteness, wasn't part of enjoyment of life. Jefferson, Jefferson was a lover in the same sense. And by a lover, I meant he was someone who walked through life. He was in love with life. He saw all the opportunities in life to fall deeply in love with certain things, with gardening, with architecture, with archaeology, with all the things that God created. Access to Jefferson, one wouldn't pray to Jefferson's God. One wouldn't sing hymns because Jefferson thought, God's not gonna hear any of that. It just doesn't mean anything. The universe is too large, and God's got more important things going on. And Jefferson's God anyway is a deist. He's a deist. God created the world and sort of stays away. I talk about that in the another lecture. But a wonderful evidence of Jefferson's love of Sterne and love of life and love of his wife is prior to her death on September 6, 1782. They copy a passage from one of Sterne's, from Tristram Shandy, Volume 10, Chapter 8. And Jefferson, his wife, Jefferson writes the first part of the passage, and then his wife continues on in her own penmanship to finish the passage. And the passage reads, and here's Jefferson's part: "Time wastes too fast. Every letter I trace tells me with what rapidity life follows my pen. These days and hours of it are flying over our heads like light clouds of windy day, never to return. More everything presses on." And then M dash and Jefferson stops writing, and his wife writes, "And every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows it are preludes to that eternal separation which we are shortly to make." It's a very beautiful passage, and I note here Jefferson, I say in my book, American Messiah, the surprisingly simple religious views of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson didn't believe in an afterlife, and I cite this passage as one of many bits of evidence. In the parting of his dear wife, he picks out a passage that talks about every time I kiss thy hand to bid adieu, every absence which follows are preludes to that eternal separation which we are shortly to make. There's no sentiment here about a reconciliation upon Jefferson's death and getting before God and the tribunal of God's judgment to see whether you go to heaven or hell. This is it. This is the only life we get. And Jefferson's severe, extensive grieving upon her passing has perhaps many explanations, one of which is guilt. But I think it's also, to some extent, is that he loved her dearly and he knew he wasn't going to see her. So here, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you, if you did, this tells me something about Jefferson. He was a Sternian. He was in love with life. He read Sterne, and Sterne talked about engaging with life, not just living it, going out and experiencing it, right? There are events. I talk of before in my own writings to students that there are events in life. Just events are just things bounded in space and time, and there are experiences. Experiences are events which you personalize, you make your own. Jefferson was interested in the experience of life. He was interested in making events experiences, and I think his mentor in that. His two mentors, one first and foremost was Jesus. Other than that, the ancient thinkers, Tacitus, Cicero, Stoics, even Plato. And very importantly as well, from the realm of fiction, was Lawrence Sterne. I hope you enjoyed this. Please like this. Please share this. And TTFN. Ta-ta for now. We'll do this again on another occasion. Have a good evening.